March brings dramatic and lethal change to your garden. We go from cool nights, mild days, to incredibly hot with not a drop of rain in sight in a matter of weeks. And obviously that spells disaster for your vegetable garden. Luckily, there are plenty of crops that do thrive in these extreme growing conditions. So let's jump into 6 picks for you to plant in your Florida garden in March. One of the biggest changes I find is in leafy greens. And I've grown leafy greens year round for, I don't know, 6-7 years now, where I meet all of our family's needs on my homestead year round with fresh leafy greens. But I have to be incredibly mindful of which leafy greens in the spring and summer months. And one of the standouts, in my personal opinion, is perpetual chard. Now, perpetual chard is going to handle our extreme temperatures much better than many of your other traditional leafy greens like lettuces and kales. But perpetual chard in particular seems to last much longer into the spring months than, say, a rainbow chard or a Ford Hook Swiss chard. With that being said, it still needs a little bit of extra care or TLC heading into our hottest months. So I would suggest planting this into part shade or nearly full shade, not dense, but it can be in a pretty shady environment. And what that's going to do is just allow this season to extend further into our hottest spring, summer months than it would if it were in full sun. Not everything in my garden is for food. Sometimes it's just for beauty or for attracting beneficial insects and pollinators. But I absolutely love it when I can combine the best of both worlds. And this plant does it. Not only is it absolutely gorgeous, it provides me with food as well as supporting the wildlife in my garden. And that is why sunflowers are a fantastic choice for planting in our spring months. These plants are incredibly productive food-wise as well as beauty. Now, there's all different varieties. There's no right or wrong here. They all do wonderfully in our climate and in this season. What I would emphasize and stress is the need for pest protection. Now, we're not talking about bugs, although they will sometimes munch on them. We're talking about squirrels. If you plant these seeds in the ground, these squirrels will very quickly find them. What I do to prevent this is when I sow them into the ground, I will take chicken wire, hardware cloth, window screening, whatever you have around, and I will gently drape it over the soil where I planted these. This prevents the squirrels from digging them up, eating the seeds, or eating the young immature seedlings. Once you have true leaves on the plant, you can remove those coverings and go about your business. But it is important, if you actually expect these sunflowers to grow into mature plants, to do some sort of preventative measures to keep the squirrels away from your sunflowers. My next pick is incredibly calorically dense storage crop that you can grow enough of to meet your needs for the entire year fairly easily. Unfortunately, it's not for my small space container gardeners. This does need room to roam, but if you have raised beds, a food forest, or any space that you can allow this to ramble, you will be so grateful for Seminole pumpkin. Now, this plant that I am sitting next to was planted last spring. It is going on nearly a year of growth and production from that original plant, which is pretty darn impressive for squash and cucurbits here in Florida. Now, I did have to give it a helping hand in the beginning. I have found it's nearly impossible to get them established if you don't hand pick the caterpillars for the first couple of weeks when it's first getting its runners going and its initial growth phase. After that point, it is very capable of maintaining itself as long as you allow it to root along the ground. Now, it does take up a lot of space, but don't trellis it, because the ability for this plant to do so well here comes from the fact that it's allowed to root along the ground. So if you want to find out more information on how to grow Seminole pumpkin and other squash that actually do well here in Florida, you can check out the video above, and that'll go through all of the details you need to get growing. As adults, we're constantly trying to convince our children that they need to eat their vegetables with their fruits. But let's be real here. We enjoy fruit just as much as they do, which is why my next pick is an annual fruit that you can grow in your garden, and that is watermelon. Now this is a super fun variety. It's called strawberry watermelon. This is a unique Florida heirloom that was introduced in the 80s. But if you have not grown watermelon before, I don't actually recommend growing this one. I would rather you start with something like early moonbeam, which is a smaller icebox melon. They're about the size of a small basketball, and when you grow something that's a little bit smaller, you're reducing or eliminating the risk of cracking and splitting, which can happen in the larger melons like strawberry melon as the summer rains start. Now, the other tip that I would highly recommend doing with your watermelon to avoid the most common problem with growing watermelons in Florida, and I would recommend growing up, not out. If you trellis your watermelons, it increases the airflow on the leaves and reduces or eliminates fungal issues in your watermelon, which is the #1 reason that watermelons die before fruiting. So highly recommend trying watermelon in your garden. Just make sure to plant it on some sort of structure that it can climb to improve that airflow. Beans are a staple crop for many folks. We can do bush beans, we can do drying beans. All of them are a great protein source, which we're not necessarily getting a whole heck of a lot of out of the other vegetables. So I always have beans planted nearly year-round in my garden. And the one that I would recommend in this time of year, heading into our hottest months, is one that you might be less familiar with. Now, we all like canned green beans, string beans. This fills the same niche, but it's like 10 times as long. And that is yard-long beans. Now, they're called yard-long beans because they grow to be a yard long. These are just like the string beans or green beans that we would find in the can, except way longer. So when I go to use them in recipes, all I do is simply cut up the bean into bite-sized pieces and cook it just like I would a normal green bean. The key difference with a long bean is that it can take the heat and humidity. If you were to try to plant a bush bean like the more familiar canned green beans, it will very quickly die out in our hot summer humid weather. So long beans are the answer to growing your green beans year-round in Florida. Definitely recommend planting these on a trellis, as they do like to climb, but they don't take up a whole heck of a lot of room, so even container gardeners can easily incorporate these into their garden plan. We just covered our green bean needs for our spring summer months, but now we need a drying bean. If you are from the South, you'll probably love this pick. If you're from the North, you may be less familiar with it or hate it entirely. But you will not be disappointed if you grow lima beans. Now, lima beans are perfectly adapted to growing in our spring months. And that's because they can grow in our drought when most other beans call it quits. This can deal with very little water and intense heat. There's all kinds of varieties of lima beans. There's garlic, there's Christmas lima bean, there's Alabama black eye, there's canned green. All of them do beautifully here. There's bush options for container gardens. There's climbing or sprawling varieties for raised beds. You name it, there's a lima bean for it. And I highly recommend planting this wonderful bean for our spring months. It can be used fresh or dried, very multi-purpose, and absolutely delicious. Fun fact, did you know that you can actually eat bean leaves too, not just the beans? They are really high in protein, just like the beans themselves, and they're an absolutely delicious cooked greens. So while you're waiting for those beans to grow, you can also be harvesting the leaves. Another often overlooked or little known fact about beans is something that can easily 10x your harvests from those beans. And if you've been growing in your garden 3 years or less, then this is going to be really important for you to get the yields that you want from your beans. If you're interested in helping your beans to do what they've literally been doing for hundreds of millions of years, make sure to watch this video next.